What if I told you that four nations you barely think about could literally trap both the United States and China in a war? Neither superpower actually wants to fight. We're not talking about Russia, not Iran, not North Korea. We're talking about four countries that operate like ghosts on the world stage. Nations so strategically positioned that they could manipulate the two most powerful countries on Earth into a conflict that would reshape everything. And here's the absolutely wild part. This isn't some distant future scenario. The pieces are already moving into place right now, and most people have no idea it's happening. These four nations have figured out something insane. In a world dominated by two superpowers, the real power doesn't belong to the biggest players. It belongs to the ones who can make the giants fight each other. So who are these ghost nations? Think about the countries that sit right in the middle of every major flashpoint between the US and China. Taiwan, obviously. But that's too obvious. We're talking about the Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, and here's the kicker, Malaysia. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Malaysia, but stay with me, because when you see how this trap actually works, you're going to realize these four countries have way more power than their military budgets would suggest. They're not trying to win a war. They're trying to make sure a war happens exactly where and when they want it to. And honestly, they're playing both sides so perfectly that neither Washington nor Beijing has fully caught on yet. Here's how the trap gets set. It starts with the Philippines. Right now, the Philippines has a mutual defense treaty with the United States that dates back decades. American forces have access to multiple bases there, especially after the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement expanded that access. But here's where it gets interesting. The Philippines has been playing this incredible balancing act, getting closer to China economically while maintaining military ties to the US. Philippine leaders know something crucial. Their country sits right along the most important shipping lanes in the world. If China ever makes a move on Taiwan, the Philippines becomes ground zero for the American response. But what if the Philippines wanted that conflict to happen? Not because they want war, but because a short, contained conflict would permanently cement American military presence in the region and unlock massive defense spending and economic aid. Now add Vietnam to the mix. Vietnam has one of the most interesting relationships with both superpowers. They literally fought a war against the United States, but now they're quietly becoming one of America's most important partners in containing China. Why? Because Vietnam and China have fought multiple wars too, and Vietnam has territorial disputes with China in the South China Sea that make their relationship super tense. Vietnam has been building up its military, buying advanced weapons, and here's the thing, they've been positioning themselves as the alternative to China for manufacturing. If a conflict broke out, Vietnam stands to gain enormously from companies fleeing Chinese supply chains. They're not just preparing to survive a US-China conflict, they're low-key preparing to profit from it. Singapore is where this gets really sophisticated. Singapore is tiny, but it's arguably the most strategically important port in the entire Indo-Pacific. They've built relationships with everyone. American carriers dock there, Chinese ships refuel there, and Singapore has made itself absolutely indispensable to both sides. But Singapore's leadership knows that their importance only lasts as long as peace is uncertain. The moment the region stabilizes completely under either American or Chinese dominance, Singapore loses its leverage. So Singapore has every incentive to keep tensions high without letting them boil over into full-scale war, at least not until Singapore has extracted maximum benefit from both sides. They're the ultimate middleman, and middlemen need the deal to stay complicated. And then there's Malaysia. This is the wild card that makes the whole trap work. Malaysia controls the western approach to the South China Sea through the Strait of Malacca. 80% of China's oil imports flow through that strait. Malaysia has been one of the quieter players in the region, not making huge waves, but slowly, systematically building relationships with China, while maintaining ties to Western powers. Malaysia's position is insane when you think about it. They could, theoretically, restrict access to the Strait of Malacca in a crisis, which would be like putting a noose around China's economy. But they could also allow Chinese forces to use Malaysian waters to bypass American naval positions. Malaysia's power comes from ambiguity, and they've been cultivating that ambiguity for years. So here's how the trap actually springs. Imagine tensions rise over Taiwan or the South China Sea. Maybe China makes a move, maybe it's just aggressive patrols, doesn't really matter. The Philippines immediately invokes its mutual defense treaty with the United States, requesting American forces to take positions in Philippine bases. The US, bound by treaty and eager to show resolve, moves forces in. But here's the twist. The Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, and Malaysia have been coordinating behind the scenes. They've created a situation where the United States is now committed to defending the Philippines. But the Philippines controls whether incidents actually escalate. A Filipino fishing boat gets harassed by Chinese Coast Guard. That could be the spark. A minor collision between vessels? That could do it. These ghost nations have effectively outsourced the decision of war or peace to themselves, and they're making sure small incidents keep happening. Meanwhile, China sees American forces massing in the Philippines and interprets this as preparation for a first strike or an attempt to blockade Chinese shipping lanes. Beijing feels like it has no choice but to respond aggressively. Maybe by increasing naval patrols, maybe by establishing air defense zones, maybe by conducting military exercises that look a lot like invasion rehearsals. Each side is reacting to the other, but neither side realizes they're both reacting to provocations carefully orchestrated by the ghost nations. Vietnam starts making noise about Chinese violations of its territorial waters, pulling more American attention and resources south. Singapore offers the U.S. expanded port access, which China sees as Singapore choosing sides, so Beijing starts pressuring Singapore economically. Malaysia makes ambiguous statements about freedom of navigation that both sides interpret as support for their position. And here's where it gets absolutely crazy. The ghost nations aren't acting irrationally. They've done the math and they've realized something terrifying. A limited conflict between the US and China would actually benefit them enormously. Think about what happens in a short, contained war. Let's say it lasts a few weeks, maybe a couple months max. Naval battles in the South China Sea, air superiority fights, maybe some missile strikes. But nothing nuclear, nothing that threatens the Chinese or American mainland directly. The Philippines would see American forces permanently stationed on its territory with no chance of withdrawal. Vietnam would become the new manufacturing hub of Asia, as every company with Chinese operations scrambles to diversify. Singapore would cement its role as the neutral ground for any peace negotiations, gaining influence with both sides. Malaysia would extract concessions from China for access to the Strait of Malacca, while simultaneously getting economic aid from the West for staying neutral or supportive. The human cost? Yeah, it would be real. Sailors would die, pilots would die, civilians in the conflict zone would suffer. But from the perspective of these ghost nations' leadership, that's a price they're willing to let others pay for their own strategic gain. And before you think that sounds too cynical, look at history. Small nations have been manipulating great powers into conflicts since forever. Look at how Serbia's actions helped trigger World War I. Look at how various Middle Eastern states have played superpowers against each other for decades. This isn't new. What's new is how sophisticated and coordinated this trap has become. Let's game out the actual conflict for a second, because this is where it gets wild. Day 1, an incident occurs. Maybe it's a Philippine Navy vessel getting rammed by a Chinese Coast Guard ship. The Philippines invokes Article 4 of the Mutual Defense Treaty, requesting consultations with the United States. Within hours, the U.S. moves carrier strike groups into position. China sees this as escalation and mobilizes its own forces. Day 3, another incident, this time involving Vietnam. A Chinese drilling platform in disputed waters. Vietnamese Coast Guard attempts to interfere. Shots fired, no one sure who shot first. Day 7, the U.S. and Japan conduct joint freedom of navigation operations. Chinese forces shadow them aggressively. A near miss between aircraft. Day 10, Malaysia announces it's closing parts of the Strait of Malacca for safety inspections. China interprets this as economic warfare backed by the U.S. Beijing issues an ultimatum: reopen the strait or face consequences. Day 14, the shooting war begins. Chinese missiles target American bases in the Philippines and Guam. U.S. submarines sink Chinese Navy vessels attempting to enforce a blockade around Taiwan. Air battles over the South China Sea. For 3 weeks, it's the most intense military conflict since World War II. But here's the thing, it stays limited. Neither side wants nuclear escalation. Neither side wants to strike the other's homeland directly. The fighting remains in the gray zone of the South China Sea and surrounding waters. Then, as quickly as it started, both sides realize they're in a stalemate. China can't project enough power to dislodge American forces from the Philippines. America can't strike deep enough into China to force capitulation. Losses are mounting. Economic damage is skyrocketing. Singapore offers to host peace talks. The aftermath is where the ghost nations win big. The United States permanently stations 50,000 troops in the Philippines, triple the previous number. Vietnam signs a comprehensive strategic partnership with the US that's everything but a formal alliance. Singapore negotiates the peace deal and positions itself as the Switzerland of Asia. Malaysia extracts $100 billion in infrastructure investment from China to guarantee future access to the Strait of Malacca, while simultaneously getting American tech companies to build new manufacturing facilities on Malaysian soil. The ghost nations engineered a conflict, managed its escalation, and profited from its conclusion. The trap worked perfectly. But wait, there's another layer to this that's even more disturbing. What if the US and China both know about the trap? What if intelligence agencies in both countries have figured out what the ghost nations are doing? Here's the thing. They might go along with it anyway. American defense contractors make billions from increased military spending in the region. Chinese military leaders get bigger budgets and more influence. Politicians in both countries get to look strong for domestic audiences. The military-industrial complexes on both sides might actually want this limited conflict to happen. The ghost nations aren't just trapping the superpowers. They're offering them an off-ramp to a conflict both sides kind of want but can't admit to wanting. And for regular people, your life changes in ways you wouldn't expect. If you're in America, suddenly there's massive government spending on the military, which means either higher taxes or more debt. Inflation spikes from disrupted supply chains. Products made in China become scarce or expensive. If you're in China, similar story, economic hardship from sanctions and disrupted trade, but also a government that's more nationalist and authoritarian in response to external threat. If you're in Southeast Asia, it depends on which ghost nation you're in, but probably you're seeing rapid militarization, economic volatility, and the stress of living in an active conflict zone, or right next to one. If you're anywhere else in the world, you're dealing with a global economy that's been fractured into US and Chinese spheres, forcing countries everywhere to pick sides. The really scary part? This scenario isn't some far-fetched hypothetical. Every element is already in place. The Philippines just gave the US access to 4 new military bases this year. Vietnam is conducting joint exercises with American forces. Singapore is expanding its port facilities. Malaysia is playing both sides harder than ever. The incidents keep happening. Near collisions at sea, airspace violations, aggressive maneuvers. Each one is a test, a probe, a way of seeing how far things can be pushed. The ghost nations are feeling out the boundaries of the trap, seeing how much tension they can create before it snaps. So what's the way out? Honestly, it requires something that seems impossible right now. The US and China recognizing they're being played and choosing not to take the bait. That means not automatically escalating when incidents occur. It means calling out the ghost nations when they're clearly manipulating situations. It means creating direct communication channels that can't be disrupted by third parties. But here's why that probably won't happen. Both superpowers have domestic political reasons to look strong. Military-industrial complexes that benefit from tension, and leaders who've built their legitimacy on standing up to the other side. The trap works because both the US and China are walking into it with their eyes open, each convinced they can manage the escalation, each sure they won't be the one who blinks first. The 4 ghost nations have figured out the ultimate hack of great power politics. You don't need aircraft carriers or nuclear weapons to shape the world. You just need to be positioned at the choke points where superpowers clash. And you need to be willing to light the match that starts the fire. The United States and China think they're playing a great game against each other. They don't realize the real game is being played by nations they barely consider rivals. And that might be the scariest thing about this whole scenario. The countries most likely to start World War III aren't the ones with the biggest militaries. They're the ones with the most to gain from making the giants fight.